A decorated Marine, his uniform crisp, his posture unshakable, stood tall before the President of the United States. The room was buzzing with energy, cameras flashing, officials watching, and the crowd waiting for what they thought would be another routine exchange of salutes and handshakes. But what happened next would silence that room in a way no one could have predicted. Instead of saluting, instead of offering a single word, the Marine locked his eyes on Donald Trump. His stare was steady, intense, and unbroken. It wasn't defiant, but it wasn't submissive either. It was the kind of stare that carried weight, history, and a story untold. The atmosphere changed instantly. The chatter stopped. Even the clicking of cameras seemed to hesitate, as if the moment itself demanded silence. The air grew heavy. You could feel it pressing down, making every second feel longer than the last. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, whispering questions to each other. Why isn't he saluting? Why isn't he speaking? The president himself appeared puzzled, his trademark confidence giving way to a rare pause. Then, with a deliberate calmness, the Marine reached into his pocket. Every eye followed his hand. Slowly, he pulled out a small object, its metallic edge catching the light. It was a medal. Not the kind awarded in ceremonies, but one that looked worn, personal, and carried with it the weight of years. The Marine stepped forward. With a firm, steady motion, he placed the medal directly into Trump's hand. The room seemed to freeze. The cameras zoomed in. The president looked down at it, then back up at the Marine, searching for an explanation. Engraved into the medal was a single name. No date, no unit, no decoration details, just one name. And that was all. The Marine didn't speak. He didn't salute. He didn't offer a single explanation for why he had done it or what the name meant. He simply held Trump's gaze for a final moment, silence speaking louder than words ever could, and then stepped back. No explanation. No speech, just silence. And that name? A silence that left the entire room unsettled. And a name that would soon carry a story far beyond those walls. The Marine was not just any soldier. He wasn't the kind of man you only saw during parades or on television. He was a combat veteran, a man who had lived through the fire of multiple tours overseas. He had walked through dust-filled villages, patrolled dangerous streets where every shadow could hide an enemy, and endured nights broken by the deafening sound of gunfire. He had seen the worst of war. He had watched friends fall, missions unravel, and had carried the kind of grief that never leaves a soldier's heart to his fellow Marines. He was known for one thing, above all else: discipline. He followed orders, he respected the chain of command, and he carried out his duty with a quiet, unshakable loyalty. In his world, rules were everything. You did your job, you had your brother's backs, and you kept moving forward, no matter how heavy the burden became. But on this day, standing before the President of the United States, something was different. This wasn't a routine military ceremony. This wasn't about medals, politics, or even recognition. This moment was deeply personal. It was about a vow one made long ago on a battlefield. Under the roar of chaos, when promises felt like lifelines, the Marine had carried that vow with him for years, etched into his very soul, and along with it, he had carried a medal, not his own. This medal was a reminder of someone else's fallen brother, whose sacrifice could not be forgotten. It had been in his pocket during missions, tucked into his gear through deployments, and kept safe as though it were more valuable than gold. He had waited for the right time, the right stage, and the right person to receive it. Not because he wanted recognition, but because he wanted that name, that story, that sacrifice to reach beyond the small circle of soldiers who had lived it. He wanted it to echo across the nation, and now in front of the most powerful man in the country, the Marine chose to act. Not with speeches, not with political statements, but with silence, and with an action so simple, yet so powerful. It spoke louder than any words ever could. That medal wasn't his. It was never meant to be. It belonged to a fallen brother in arms, a young Marine whose story was carved into the heart of everyone who had ever served alongside him. The engraved name on it read, Private First Class Daniel Reed, Daniel Reed wasn't a hardened veteran. He was only 19 years old, barely out of training, still carrying the spark of a teenager with big dreams. He was the kind of Marine who lifted spirits in the worst of times. When the nights dragged on and the tension of war pressed heavy on the unit, Daniel would be the one cracking jokes, telling stories from back home, and pulling candy bars from his pockets to share with anyone who needed a quick taste of normal life. He had a smile that could cut through exhaustion. And he carried with him a simple dream to make it back home. Marry his high school sweetheart and start the life he had always imagined. His friends used to tease him about how often he talked about her, how he carried her letters folded neatly in his pack. For Daniel, those letters were his anchor, a reminder of what he was fighting for. But dreams have a way of being stolen in war. One night, during a sudden and violent ambush, everything changed. The unit came under fire, chaos erupted, and split-second decisions had to be made. In that moment, Daniel didn't hesitate. He saw danger where his brother stood, and without thinking of himself, he threw his body into the line of fire. He shielded his fellow Marines, giving them the seconds they needed to survive seconds that cost him his own life. Daniel Reed never came home. His family received the folded flag, the official letter, and the Medal of Honor that recognized his sacrifice. But that wasn't the only medal Daniel had. He had a second one, a small token he kept on his chain, close to his heart. After his death, that medal ended up in the hands of his closest comrade, the very Marine who now stood silently before the president. For years, that Marine carried it, not as a trophy, but as a promise. A vow whispered in the chaos of battle. One day, I will make sure this name is not forgotten. So why did the Marine give the medal to Donald Trump? And why in complete silence? The answer can be summed up in one word: symbolism. The Marine wasn't there to argue about policies, to praise, or to criticize. He wasn't trying to take a side in politics. What he wanted was something far greater. He wanted attention. He wanted the nation's eyes on a single name: Private First Class Daniel Reed. Think about it. If he had told Daniel's story during an interview, maybe a few people would have listened. If he had posted about it online, the post might have been scrolled past and forgotten. But handing that medal directly to the President of the United States, in front of flashing cameras, national press, and a room full of witnesses, that moment was guaranteed to be recorded, broadcast, and remembered by choosing the President as the one to receive the medal. The Marine wasn't just passing an object, he was passing a legacy. He was ensuring that Daniel Reed's sacrifice reached not just his grieving family, not just his fellow Marines, but the entire country. He wanted Daniel's name to echo far beyond the battlefield, far beyond the quiet corners of memory, and into the spotlight where the world could see it. And then there was the silence. That silence was no accident. It was deliberate, calculated, and incredibly powerful. Words, after all, can be twisted. Speeches can be ignored or misquoted. But silence? Silence cannot be changed. It forces people to sit in discomfort, to wonder, to ask questions. Silence lingers in the mind long after the moment has passed. When the Marine handed over that medal without saying a single word, he created a moment that no one could easily explain away. The silence became the story. And in that silence, the engraved name on the medal, Daniel Reed, spoke louder than anything the Marine could have said. Trump himself seemed caught off guard. Known for always having something to say, for once he paused, staring down at the medal. The cameras zoomed in, the room grew still, and the crowd fell silent. And in that silence, Daniel Reed's name carried more weight than 1,000 speeches ever could. The story spread like wildfire. Within hours, clips of the Marine handing Donald Trump the medal began circulating online. News outlets replayed the footage, social media exploded with discussion, and millions of people across the nation found themselves asking the same question: who was Daniel Reed? Search engines lit up as people typed his name, uncovering the story of a 19-year-old Marine who had given his life to protect his brothers in arms. For many, it was the first time they had ever heard his name. And suddenly, a young man who had died quietly on a battlefield years ago was now remembered and honored by an entire country. Of course, the moment sparked debate. Some argued about politics. Some claimed the Marine was making a statement for or against Trump. Others questioned his silence, wondering if it was an act of defiance or respect. But beyond all the noise, one truth stood firm and undeniable. Daniel Reed's sacrifice had been pulled out of the shadows of memory and placed into the light of national attention. That was the Marine's mission all along, and he had accomplished it. He didn't need applause. He didn't need recognition. He needed only one thing to make sure Daniel's name was not forgotten, and in doing so, he left behind a lesson that goes far beyond politics, far beyond ceremonies. It's a reminder that honor doesn't always come with medals pinned on uniforms or speeches given on stages.
Sometimes true honor comes from one person carrying the weight of a promise and keeping it no matter how many years pass. Sometimes the most powerful statements aren't shouted. They aren't written in long speeches or plastered across headlines. Sometimes they are delivered in silence, a silence so strong it forces people to stop, to think, and to remember. So the next time you hear about heroes, don't just think of the famous names written in history books. Think of Daniel Reed, a 19-year-old Marine who never came home, but whose bravery saved lives. Think of the Marine who stood in silence, refusing to let that sacrifice fade. And remember this: actions, especially the quiet ones, can echo far louder than words.